Welcome back to Veterans Forum, a program by veterans, about veterans, for veterans and their families. I'm your co-host, Bob West, with Ray Chattery and Jerry Devlin. Our goal is to provide you and your family with important information about programs, projects, and legislation that's important to you and your family by introducing leaders in our community. Jerry, who do we have with us today?
We're really fortunate to have someone who's preserving a very vital history, which is, without people like Heidi St. George, might well have been lost. She's a native of California who really grew up in a suburb of Portland, Oregon called Aloha. And came to this area with her husband, who was a retired Air Force non-commissioned officer and a very distinguished soldier in his own right. And she's been working on military history of Maryland. And it's very important because we lose so many World War II veterans every day, and with them goes a great slice of Maryland and American history. Nice to have you with us, Heidi.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you, Heidi, for being with us. Of course, the important thing is her husband was an Air Force guy, so there's always a higher quality there that we expect. So, Heidi, certainly welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And your project really was really part of a degree program in history.
Correct.
And you got involved by talking to Jim Hauser, who we all know. He's a
Yes.
Purple Heart veteran. He was Veteran of the Year for Maryland. And tell us how Jim sort of inspired you to go off on this tangent of Maryland veteran oral history.
Well, I started a class in oral history for a master's degree in public history. And public history is sort of your behind the scenes history, your museum displays, your placards, and things like that. So one of the assignments for the class was to interview anyone of our choosing. And I decided to call the local Purple Heart chapter. And I got a hold of Jim Hauser, and he said, "I'll do it." And I said, "That's wonderful." And I said, "What war were you in?" And he said, "The Vietnam War." And I was hesitant because I didn't really know a lot about it, and I didn't have that many weeks in class to learn. But with my bachelor's degree in psychology, I thought, he's really open about the PTSD. We can discuss this. And when we completed the interview, he began to share other stories. And I couldn't believe that these stories weren't being saved. And so when it came time to do my practicum, I went back to Jim and his chapter, and I proposed doing an in-house oral history project for the Maryland Purple Heart. And he invited me to a DEC meeting, and I was given a chance to stand up and speak and ask for volunteers for this. And Jim Huber popped up like a little jack-in-the-box. And he said, "I've been looking for an oral historian for years. Please wait till after the meeting. I want to speak with you." And that's sort of what got it rolling.
So the important thing for everybody to remember is these are for anybody who served, regardless of whether it was overseas or in the States, whether it was just a couple of years or through retirement. It could be any period at all. Mm-hmm. And it's not just veterans who entered the service from Maryland,
Correct.
But anyone who is currently a veteran living in Maryland.
Right. I didn't want to exclude anyone that had joined in California, such as my husband, who was from Washington, because when you're in the military, you're all over. And people end up thousands of miles away from where they're born, and I didn't want to exclude them on the basis of that.
So how many interviews have you done so far?
We are a little over 40.
And do you segment them by the period that they served, or how are you doing
That's
that?
how I organize them, is their main time that they served. If it's World War II or Korea or Vietnam or Gulf War. For the project, when I was doing it as a practicum, I had World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The young current veterans, I don't think are ready to speak yet. So I just concentrated on those 3 wars. But this is open to anybody of any conflict.
And also, as our big push is trying to reach out to women veterans.
Yes.
And how successful have you been in that?
I have actually made contact with the Women's Veterans League Committee, the Women's Veterans Committee, and we are working on coordinating getting me to meet female veterans, but I'm researching that currently. So I haven't established a questionnaire yet.
Well, one thing we can tell you is we have 2 ladies or female veterans in our VFW post who served in Kuwait.
In the Gulf War, the first Gulf War.
No, this is the second.
Yeah, it was.
No, this is the
okay.
the second, because they just got back a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
They were there for a year. Phoebe Larned, and she just went out as commander of the American Legion here in Bowie. And Lieutenant Colonel Megan Bogley, she's our senior vice commander for the local VFW post.
Okay.
So you might want to contact them, because I know both of them be able to give you really good intake on what it was like for them to be in Kuwait.
Yes.
And Joanne Fisher.
Joanne Fisher, yeah, well, she's
I mean, she would, because of her connections with the women veterans.
right,
She would be extremely helpful too. So,
right.
so after we'll have a few more point of contacts for you to help in that area, because we certainly want to get more involvement of women veterans in our service organizations.
Women are pretty incredible in what they do, and they've climbed from what they did in World War I to what they're doing now. Being on the battlefield is an incredible journey. And
Well, the Gulf War changed that,
It did.
because we've had several female veterans that served in Vietnam, but they were strictly non-combatant administrators. And one thing is the nurses and the chaplain corps, they were non-combatants. So.
Right.
You know, and Jerry too, you with the Veterans Court type of information about how that intertwines with part of Maryland veteran history. That's a new aspect here in Maryland that Jerry is a retired, well, he's sort of like a quasi-active retired judge.
Whatever.
Certainly would be a great source, you know, about that sort of information, especially from his association with the legislation and so forth.
And also, Prince George's County was one of the first areas in the state to establish the Veterans Court, and Judge Sheila Tillison Adams is the administrative judge, and she's been, from the very beginning, a very big backer of the Veterans Court. That's what we call a specialty court.
So you kind of fell into this project as part of your master's degree.
Correct. I was actually scheduled to enter another master's program in museum studies. And all of my experiences throughout my life, and I was a paraprofessional counselor at a domestic violence shelter. And I developed incredible interview skills. And to be able to pull a coherent story out of someone in crisis and learn to not react to some of the horror stories that you're listening to is a real skill. And it benefited me so much in this project. And I've always loved our military. And my father was a Korean War veteran, and so I kind of grew up on his stories. And my father and I had an incredibly close relationship. And that kind of inspired me with men. I'm much more comfortable with men, and they sense that. And I'm very fortunate that in the interviews, they're very comfortable, and they will open up and tell me a lot.
So you said your psychology degree has helped you as part of this project.
Immensely, not only with interviewing them, but with structuring the questionnaire. I based the questionnaire on what is called structured life review. So we look at their whole life. The questionnaire is designed for any combat issues to fall in the middle of the interview, because your memory works in beginnings and ends, and you usually forget what's in the middle. So when they finish an interview, we don't finish right after combat. We follow their life through up to what they're doing today. And so having an understanding of how the brain works and how this structured life review examines their entire life has been instrumental. And they tell me, I've had a number of Vietnam veterans come back and say, I've never had anything give me this kind of relief. To look at my whole life, and my service in Vietnam seemed smaller and not as significant as it was before, because I'd seen all these other historical events and I've done all these other things in my life. So,
since you interview individuals who have served at various times, have you found anything unexpected or new, or have you seen some similarities between older veterans and somewhat younger veterans?
When I first began going to the project for my practicum, focused with the Purple Heart, just because I could do that in 4 months. And so I began talking to them about, we studied in psychology that so many of the Vietnam veterans were drug addicts there. And they were up in arms. No, that's not true. When you were out of the wire, you had to be alert. You had to be awake. You could not be sedated in any way. And so I learned that while all the books and resources that I had been using were informative, they were not always accurate. And I also learned that in a specific battle or in a specific place, that 2 different men have vastly different experiences, but they're in the same place. But the veterans themselves have become incredible sources of information for follow-up interviews. Someone will say something and I will be able to take that into another interview and share it with another veteran, and that will trigger a response or memories or stuff like that.
Now, since your husband is also a veteran, you might have picked up something in your conversations with your husband that kind of helped.
Some of the lingo, the military-ese, sort of that military speak and acronyms and things like that. So there are a lot of things in interviews that they'll give me an acronym, or, I PCS, and you don't have to translate that, and I get it. But I also get what the soldiers go through and the sacrifices. It's not always an arm or a leg. It's birthdays, it's Christmases, it's anniversaries. And so sitting home, keeping the home fires burning, when my husband was deployed to Iraq, really gave me a huge insight into what these guys volunteer for. They volunteer for it now.
Well, in Vietnam, of course, we had the Army, we had the Marine Corps, and then you had the Navy, who were on the river patrols. Have you had an opportunity to speak to?
I've had mostly, I had one World War II veteran who was Navy, and I was able to follow his entire 4 years on his ship, but a lot of Marine and Army.
From the Korean War, or?
I've only had 2 from the Korean War, which is really tragic because we are forgetting them for a second time in history. And I would really, really like this opportunity to ask if there are any Korean War veterans.
I'll tell you one that you really want to talk to is Bill L.E. He wrote 2 books about the Korean War. He got to Korea 30 days after the Chosun Reservoir. And he's right here in Bowie. Okay. And I mean, you could probably fill up 50 pages, but he, like I said, he wrote 2 books. The first book, and then he updated the book. And I'll tell you, was as I say, Marine, and he can really give you some really good insight of what it was like, and also with his history of writing the book and such. But I mean, it's just really fantastic.
Okay.
So I can give you his number and everything.
You have some props with us today.
Well, what I do when I start an interview is I have some pictures of my father when he was in Korea, and that sort of serves to establish a connection between myself and the veteran. But men are very tactile. They like to touch things, and I find things trigger many more memories than just asking questions. And one of the things that I use with our World War II veterans is a ruptured duck pin.
Right. Yeah.
And they love to see these. Oh, I remember when I got mine, and I was so proud that I had served and I could wear that on my clothes.
I'm old enough to remember those, and that was how veterans who had been discharged before the end of the war weren't getting heckled about not being in the service and so forth.
Right. I also have books that were printed just for the soldiers in the war, in World War II. These became incredibly important, and they preserved them and took care of them with their lives because they were so important.
I thought that was a book full of coupons.
No,
It says Starbucks on
Green
it.
stamps.
they're books, they shrunk them down, took a full-size book because they had started a program, some librarians started a program sending all these hardbound books, and they were very heavy and very bulky.
Sure.
And so this is what they came up with.
Well, that's interesting. The first paperbacks.
Yeah.
And
Paper was in short supply.
I also have the ration books.
Right. I have mine.
And if you didn't spend all of your ration material, they gave you these little coins that you could use because they weren't printing new money. And this just really helps these men to open up because they will share things that they would think weren't important. And they will open up a lot more when they have something. And I have a boonie hat that is Vietnam era. And these guys just, I remember this, and we used to do this, and we used to put bullets here, or I'd put, things in my hat, and we would do this with them, and it just brings the interview to a much, much different level.
And you have a newspaper?
I have
Stars and Stripes. Oh, no,
Oh,
it's
it's Yank.
Yang.
yeah, that's what World War II then.
Yes, and these are very hard to come by.
I would imagine.
But these are printed. This was started by enlisted men for everyone. But if you were an enlisted man and you made officer and you were on the staff, you were done. You had to move on. This was only for enlisted. And they printed some very, very controversial articles and opinions. But this was a voice that the enlisted didn't have otherwise. So this really brings back a lot of memories.
So when you start your interview process, you start by having these props
Yes.
with you. But you said you had a questionnaire.
I have a questionnaire that I will sometimes work from. I never know. Sometimes the story will just fall out and I don't need it, but I use it because I have included certain memorable dates for pop culture. Where were our Vietnam veterans when Kennedy was shot? When I sat down and did my first interview with Jim Huber, and we began the interview, and he said something about, I remember we saw Kennedy open up the JFK Expressway. And it dawned on me, I'm missing so much history. It wasn't just Vietnam that he experienced all this time before that, and he experienced some very pivotal moments in American history, especially being back here. And so I took 2 weeks and I re-researched, and I put in a lot of pop culture, a lot of international events. Where were you when Sputnik went up? Where were you when Gary Powers was shot down? And so, because initially my research had covered just history. And some men in the Korean War said, well, I landed in Da Nang, but I don't know where I was after that. I was just in the jungle after that. And the history wasn't as important as it was for me to study experiences, because that's what brought the story out.
So you've done 40-some interviews so far.
I believe so.
Is there an end to your project, like when you're done, or?
I would like to say that there would be an end, that we would not have veterans that had any combat experience, but that's not very realistic. At this point, I don't see an end. I want to see this as something that could be handed down for generations. This is important that we leave a record that our veterans are just human beings, but they're incredible human beings. And I want to leave a body of evidence that shows them as what they are. And especially our veterans now that are volunteering to sleep in sand, to eat cold MREs and drink hot water and march through 120-degree deserts. This is an incredible thing that people are missing. With only 1% of the population joining the military, this isn't an experience that most people can relate to anymore.
So have you completed your degree, or?
Yes.
You completed the degree.
Yes.
So this is a project you're going to continue?
This is what we are doing now. Jim Huber and myself we are in the process of turning this into a nonprofit so that we can seek grants and funding and donations to keep this project going. So not only are we looking to collect interviews, but we're looking to make this a professional project.
So this might be something that we can get the word out about what's happening and so forth. 'Cause,
Yes.
I mean, right now you're dealing with only the Purple Heart, it seems.
No, I have opened it up. That was just for the practicum. Any veteran of the VFW, the DAV, the American Legion, other Purple Heart chapters, it's open to anybody.
Now, have you contacted your local, like American Legion and VFW, where you live?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And have they been open to you, or?
Yes. Yes, I've worked with a couple of people from American Legion that have volunteered to sit and do an interview. Usually what happens is I need to get a couple of people that are in there to go through it, and then they can talk to other people and say, this is really an amazing thing. It's not traumatic. I don't ask, if you killed someone, or that's not it. These are not my interviews. I'm the facilitator. This is the veterans interview, and they tell their story their way.
And how long does it typically take to do an interview?
It can range anywhere from a half an hour to 2 hours. The longest I did was the World War II Navy veteran, because I had followed his path for 4 years on the same ship. It was pretty lengthy. He was 97, so he had a lot of memories, and I didn't want to let those memories go, and we lost him last year. And Jim Huber's chapter, I have conducted 3 interviews of his members that have passed away. And so that just brings this home even more, that this is important that we collect these interviews now.
Now, as I say, the Joint Veterans Committee of Maryland, there are 6 major veterans organizations, and the state commanders are normally at these meetings. We'll start the 3rd Wednesday in September. But the 3rd Wednesday in October would be an outstanding time, because that's normally it's in between month.
Okay.
Like in November, we'll have our Veteran of the Year selectee. In December, we have our party. In January, February, and March is when Jerry he's a legislative chairman, when they do it in Annapolis. But you might want to put the 3rd Wednesday in October down.
I will.
And
I would appreciate it.
And then you can, have a presentation there, because I say we need something to fill up the time for that month. And I say that's the only really non-month that we have that don't have anything going on. So that would
Okay.
be a very, very good time for you to come
I
by.
really
And
appreciate it.
your history is one of the fundamental changes in the way history is taught. At age 84, I'm still a graduate student at College Park, and I took my first history graduate course in 1960, graduated from college in 1959. And those days, now they have the kind of history, it's called history from the bottom. In other words, it's not quite so important what General MacArthur said or did, it's what the GIs said and did. And this is, a fundamental change in the way the discipline has evolved.
So you need to put Jerry on your list as a
Yes,
veteran, and you get that.
I think so.
He had the hardest job in the Marine Corps. He had to teach Marines how to speak English.
I was an English instructor. Probably all the people you've interviewed, you've never interviewed anybody who fought split infinitives and dangling participles.
No, no, but you better be careful because my uncle was a Marine for 27 years.
Well, we always say
He
there's a
served
great
in-
Marine oxymoron. It's called Marine intelligence.
Yes.
Well, you're sitting by.
Yeah, now
among two.
the joint veterans is the AMVETS, the Catholic War Veterans, Disabled American Veterans, Marine Corps League, the Purple Heart, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Okay.
So you have the 6 major organizations. They probably represent maybe 85% of the veterans in Maryland.
I am very anxious to work with other veteran service organizations because we are putting our board together right now. And I would love to have members that represent other veteran service organizations on our board so that we would have much more access into the veteran community. And it could really round things out, and they would have contacts that I wouldn't think about. I've only been in the veteran community for 3 months, as far as my husband goes, but I've been doing this for a couple of years now, so.
And like you said, you went to the American Legion DEC. Well, you can find out from the state commanders when their DECs are, and go each month go and visit one of their DECs, and at that part they have normally the cream of the crop there.
Okay.
Yeah, and then also at the War Memorial Building in Baltimore, that's where all the department headquarters are. There's the 4 of them up there, and that'll be a good start.
Right.
Well, it's kind of hard to believe, but our 30 minutes is up. We certainly want to, we appreciate Heidi being here, and if you're interested in being part of her project, then all you have to do is stop by the American Legion or the DAV, and we'll certainly get you in contact with Heidi. And again, in order to be active, you have to stop by one of either the American Legion or the DAV. Come on out and find out what about your benefits. If you're a family member, we certainly welcome you too. And we're also encouraging women veterans to come over to the service organizations and find out about the benefits that you've earned and you deserve. And we want to thank all of you for watching Veterans Forum.